Recording it. And good evening, everyone. And here we are at the final session of our tour through the English Reformations and arriving at the early Stuart Church this evening. So what we're going to be looking at this evening is just about 40 years of history with a slightly arbitrary cut-off date, which I'll say a bit more about later, in which there was a really substantial further set of religious change in England, which possibly led to, certainly contributed to the civil wars and the wars between England and Scotland and Ireland in the mid-17th century. There is a significant amount of historical debate about whether the civil wars, the English civil wars and the wars of the Three Kingdoms, as they're usually now called, can be characterised as religious conflict or not, or in what sense religious conflict. But that's the kind of point at which we're going to draw stumps on the tour of the English Reformation. If you think back to the first week, there is a reasonable case to be made about that the Reformation can broadly be considered as running till about 1700, but it'll become clear why we're going to stop where we're going to stop when we get to it. And so key themes for this evening, if the PowerPoint will work. So as we look at the Jacobean and Caroline churches, the churches under James I and Charles I, we'll spend a bit of time looking at Laudianism and a reimagining of England's Reformation, and a bit of time thinking about the ways in which that has been influential in the way that the Reformation story and history has been told from the 19th century and especially in the 20th century in the Church of England. We'll think a bit about the breakdown into civil war, and we'll come back to some questions about when we can talk about a thing that we might now recognise as Anglicanism, and what kind of church was the Church of England. So we start with the death of Elizabeth I in 1603. And Elizabeth had never married, and her successor was James VI of Scotland, James Stuart, who was the son of Mary Queen of Scots, who, as you'll remember from last week, Elizabeth had executed in 1586. James had been king in Scotland since 1560, so he had come to the throne as an infant when his mother was deposed from the throne, and Scotland had had a very different Reformation history from England. The Scottish Church was Calvinist, strictly Calvinist, rather than Reformed Protestant. And so when James ascended to the English throne, those Puritans who during Elizabeth's reign had been looking for further reform of the Church of England were very excited indeed. They thought their moment had arrived. Now was our moment to make the English church more like the best reformed churches of Scotland and of continental Europe. So as James rode south to claim his new additional crown, he was met on the road and presented with a thing that is generally known as the millenary petition. I think I might have missed an N out of that one, in which a series of demands were made for the further reform of the Church of England in the sort of Protestant Puritan vein that Elizabethan Puritans had been agitating for, as we talked about last week. So back from the Vestiarian controversies, back through the admonition to the Parliament and all that followed that, and particularly concern about the persistence of cathedrals, of bishops, of prescriptive liturgy in the terms of the Book of Common Prayer, all these kinds of things. James's response was to say, let's have a meeting and talk about it. And so a conference to discuss religious affairs was called to Hampton Court in 1603-4. It was, from the Puritan point of view, a huge disappointment, because the thing was, James had rather decided that he quite liked some of what went with the church that he found in his new kingdom as he rode south. So the Hampton Court Conference, one of the demands that was made by the petitioners, one of the demands that had been consistently made by English Puritans, had been around the use of the signing of the cross in baptism. And rather than getting rid of it as a superstitious relic, what the Hampton Court Conference does in the series of canons that flow from it, and the 1603 canons remain in force in the Church of England until after the Second World War. They remain the only set of canons in force in the Church of England until the second half of the 20th century. What goes into the 1603 canons is a great long defence of why the Church of England uses the signing of the cross in baptism. And so that's just one example. There are some slight, tiny amendments to the Book of Common Prayer liturgy, but nothing that looks like a concession to Puritan demands, except one thing. They want a new translation of the Bible. Ideally, really like the Geneva Bible, the Bible that has been used in Geneva, which has marginal notes, glosses, which tell you how you're supposed to interpret the text, which give you material for sermons and, you know, the proper theological reading from a Reformed Protestant perspective of the text of Scripture. So there's a kind of kick it into the long grass mode of approach to this demand for the Bible to be translated. And a commission is set up that will look into translating the Bible. And what happens in 1611 is the publication eventually of this, which is a 400th anniversary version of the 1611 Bible that we tend to know as the King James Bible or the Authorized Version. And it was a phenomenal undertaking, the King James Bible. So teams of translators with a kind of editorial board over the top divided up the whole text of Scripture and undertook a significant scholarly undertaking to produce this authorized, recognized translation, which became in some ways one of the most influential texts in the English language back when it was the 400th anniversary of it back in 2011. There was all kinds of literature published and, you know, newspaper articles and things telling us about the influence that the King James Bible had had on the English language. All sorts of everyday phrases, all sorts of things that we just know because they're in the text of the King James Bible. So it wasn't what the Puritan petitioners at Hampton Court had wanted, for sure, because they had wanted something that gave you a Reformed Protestant reading of the text. That is not what was produced, what was published in 1611. But what was published in 1611 was hugely, hugely influential down the centuries, possibly remaining so today. Significant in that undertaking was somebody we'll come to again in a moment, Lancelot Andrewes. One of the things that characterised James's church was that although he did not concede to the Puritan demands for further reform, what he consistently did throughout his reign was to strike a balance between moderate Puritans on the one hand, and those who, as we'll see in a moment, were seeking a different type of reform on the other. And he balanced, in terms of who was promoted and who was preferred, these different developing theological strands within the Church of England. What we'll see when we come to look at Charles in Charles's reign in a few minutes' time is the way in which that balance was upset and the sort of equilibrium that exists under James disturbed when Charles basically stops any sort of preferential treatment, any sort of recognition of the more Puritan strain within the Church of England, but we'll come to that in a moment. So one of the people who was most influential in the production and publication of the King James Bible was Lancelot Andrewes, who is second in after Richard Hooker. We'll talk about Hooker in a moment. Now, Andrewes had a fairly sort of standard Cambridge theological Protestant CV. He had studied at Pembroke College and was rector of St Giles Cripplegate in London, and then became subsequently bishop in Ely and Chichester and Winchester. And he had a hugely influential career. What he was particularly good at was preaching, and he was the star preacher at James's court. He preached on practically every festival, major festival throughout James's reign. And following his death, he died in 1626. Following his death, his collection of sermons was published and became hugely influential. Now, Andrewes is interesting. So he'd come from this very kind of late Elizabethan, Cambridge Divine, sort of Calvinist consensus that we spoke of last week background. But he starts to move theologically and devotionally and in ways which become very significant. So he and a whole network of people with whom he's also associated, all of whom have some connection to Westminster School and to Westminster Abbey, start to put a different sort of emphasis on what the Church of England's Reformation could be like. And it's an emphasis that is based very much in appreciation of the prayer book liturgy. So whereas Puritans were wanting to change that liturgy, what this group of people, we'll talk about their naming in a moment, tend to want to do is to emphasize it and to think of ways of developing the liturgy as a key aspect of what it means to be an English Protestant. Now, Andrewes does this in the position of somebody who really is a star preacher and is recognised as such. Not so the person on the far side of the screen, Richard Hooker. Richard Hooker sits in this session, although he died in 1600. And Richard Hooker was a jurist. He undertook massive defence of the Church of England in what was published in successive volumes as his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Often when we talk about Hooker, we talk about him having this kind of three-legged stool of scripture, tradition, and reason, and think of those those three prongs as the kind of basis of how Anglicans think about theology. Richard Hooker never talked about a three-legged stool. And for Hooker, it's absolutely crystal clear in his writings that scripture is primary in the way that it is primary in the 39 Articles. But what Hooker starts to do, following on from the kind of defences that Whitgift, Elizabeth's Archbishop of Canterbury, had made in response to the admonition to the Parliament and the controversies around that, what Hooker starts to do is to provide rationale and justification and defence for the Church of England and for churches to make their own, to conclude their own practice in ways that might be determined beyond the strict reading of what is actually in the text of Scripture. So Hooker doesn't require that every single thing you want to do have scriptural mandate. Hooker requires that you can make an argument for it. And he makes a lot of his arguments from natural law principles. And he thinks a lot about structure and hierarchy and good ordering of both church and society. And Hooker makes a huge move in the course of his laws of ecclesiastical polity. If we think back to the early Reformation, particularly the sort of flavour of the Reformation polemic that we see in the mid-Tudor period, the sorts of emphases that are in Fox's Book of Martyrs, we see this sort of standard Protestant tropes of the Pope as Antichrist, the standard Protestant tropes of the Church of Rome as a false church or not a church. I think Luther talks of the Babylonian captivity of the church. Hooker does not unchurch the Roman church. Now, to us now, that sounds like a fairly uncontroversial statement. But in the context of turn of the 17th century English Protestantism, it is a huge conceptual move. And one of the things that we see in this strain of reimagining England's Reformation is a consistent suspicion by its critics that it's really some sort of crypto-Catholicism. For the most part, it really clearly isn't, but they've made a huge and significant move. And we mustn't underestimate that. The historian Anthony Milton, in I'm afraid, another doorstop-sized book. There are lots of doorstop-sized books in the history of the English Reformation. But Anthony Milton wrote what remains the best study by a long shot of any of this in his book on Catholic and Reformed, which looks at both Roman and Protestant churches in English Protestant thought in the early part of the 17th century, and thinks about how people are talking about and thinking about the church. And that Milton's book is now probably about 25 years old, but there's nothing as there's nothing as nothing like it in terms of how he analyzes the shifts in this theological thinking that take place in the early 17th century. So what are we calling these people? So we've got Hooker. Hooker dies in 1600. The successive volumes of his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity are published, some of them within his lifetime, some of them not until much later. Volumes 6 and 8, it's 8 volumes. Volumes 6 and 8 are published in 1648. There's some discussion about whether all of volume 7 is by Hooker. But books 1 to 5 are published just about the time he dies. He has very little actual influence at the time, but becomes hugely, hugely influential later on, when people start to think about what kind of church the Restoration Church of England is. So the person on the far right-hand side of your screen is William Laud, who becomes Charles I's Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, when people talk about the rise of this movement, it tends to be called Laudianism, or in some of the older historiography, English Arminianism, which links it to a different theological controversy that was going on in the Low Countries, in the Netherlands at the time. None of that works terribly well. If you call it high church, it has later connotations that link it to sort of 19th century Tractarianism and Anglo-Catholicism and what we tend to think of as high church now, sort of ceremonial liturgy and things that wouldn't have made much sense at the time. So the historian Peter Lake, in about 40 years ago, coined the term avant-garde conformity. It's a bit of a clumsy phrase and not terribly, doesn't trip off the tongue terribly easily. But what's useful about it, and what's really useful about it, is that it emphasizes that what these folk all wanted was conformity to a version of the settlement church, conformity to prayer book practice, but they wanted to push the bounds of what that conformity represented. They wanted to alter, in a sense, what that conformity represented. So whereas we might think of Puritan critics of the settlement church and the prayer book as non-conformists, again, with the caveats about later use of that term to mean non-Anglican Protestants in England, what this phrase does is it points that they just want to push the bounds of conformity. And we'll see that particularly once Laud becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, which he does under Charles I. I'll come to in a minute. The other chap on the screen is John Cousin, who has a stellar career in the Caroline Church, and then at the Restoration comes back as Bishop of Durham. He becomes very significant in the 1630s. In his early career in Durham, he had fallen out with just about everybody. I think he was a very difficult man to work with. A lot of it about ceremonial and about reordering of church space. Falling out about pews is not a new thing in the Church of England. But one of the things Cousin does, so Andrews and Cousin both publish collections of private devotions, which are intended as complements to the prayer book. And both of them in that start to use liturgical resource that is certainly not mainstream Reformed Protestant piety, that is very closely based on patristic sources. And one of the things that is a constant feature of the sort of theological development that we see in early 17th, in this mode of revising the Reformation in the early 17th century, is an interest in the patristic church and increasingly in the Eastern churches and in Orthodox tradition, as people start to look for non-Roman arguments in favour of some aspects of traditional practice. So there are plenty, I mean, there are a whole host of other people that we might think of in terms alongside Laud and Andrews and Cousin as part of this movement, but they're some of the key people. And in the 1620s, they become known as the Durham House Group, based around the house of the Bishop of Durham in London. The Bishop of Durham at the time is Richard Neal, and they become much embroiled in arguments about doctrines of predestination, which is why they tend to be called, in some of the older historiography, Arminians or English Arminians, or slightly more ambiguously, the historian Nicholas Tyack referred to them as anti-Calvinists. So his argument was that what they all had in common was an objection to the kind of Calvinist consensus that was there in the Church of England at the end of Elizabeth's reign, but actually they came at it. They came at that from different perspectives and with different emphases. So that movement, that reimagining of England's Reformation, of the nature of English Protestantism, is happening from the latter years of Elizabeth's reign. But it becomes really significant after the death of James I. So in 1624-5, depending on whether you use modern or old style dating, he is succeeded by his son Charles. And if we're going to think in a 1066 and all that way, Charles I was just not very good at being king. And more or less from the get-go, there's political instability, there's increasing financial instability. He falls out with Parliament. Parliament is suspended. He implements personal rule. And one of the things that really highlights the extent to which Parliament had developed over the course of England's sort of Reformation century, if you like, was the way in which a Parliament that didn't exist as a standing institution when Henry VIII wanted to break with Rome, Parliament that was only called when the king wanted to raise taxes, which he usually only wanted to do if he wanted to go to war. The influence Parliament as an institution and a body and as a feature of English life had gained and developed over that century was really very, very substantially highlighted by the ways in which Charles I falls out rather spectacularly with Parliament. But for our particular perspective, more than thinking about some of that constitutional stuff, or indeed some of the economic and political history, fascinating though it is, possibly more substantial, but more significant in telling the story of the English Reformation, is the way in which he pursued religious policy and the way in which he sought to change the Church of England. Charles I really liked the sorts of things that these avant-garde conformists, who we might start to call Laudians, were saying. William Laud, from the late 16 teens, when he was Dean of Gloucester, had been very busy implementing East End altar policies. So one of the things we haven't really talked about too much is about the actual space of worship. So if we think back to Edward's church, where the walls were whitewashed, the stained glass was removed, all those statues went, all that kind of thing, what you end up with is basically a nave and then a chancel. And the chancel is most of the time fairly obsolete space, because you don't need it most of the time, because most of the time you aren't having communion, and most of the time your major services are morning prayer and a homily, or possibly preaching, or matins and anti-communion, so the prayer but communion service up as far as the comfortable words. What happens at a communion service, according to the Elizabethan injunctions, is that the communion table, which is a table, not a stone fixed altar, the table lives against the east wall of the church. And when you're having your communion service, you get it out and you move it down and you turn it through 90 degrees so that it sits on an east-west axis, sort of longwise in the chancel. And so when the prayer book rubric says that the priest stands at the north end of the table, they're standing at a long side of a communion table, not a short side of a communion table, if that makes sense. And people come and they gather around it to receive communion. And there are woodcut prints and illustrations from the 1560s and 70s of people doing precisely that. One of the things that is controversial in the Church of England practice is whether you should have to kneel to receive communion or not. In most Reformed Protestant churches, people sit on benches around the table to receive. The prayer book still assumes that you kneel. And that is controversial. And there's a huge amount of controversial literature published from the late 16 teens and through the 1620s about whether you should kneel at the communion or not. But what avant-garde conformists, particularly William Laud, do is they push a policy that restores East End altars. And they call them altars. And in some places, the communion table is replaced with a stone altar, and they rail them. So we take altar rails for granted now in lots of churches, and there's lots of Jacobean and Caroline woodwork, so 17th century woodwork, 17th century altar rails and things left. And the arguments for railing altars are sort of sensible arguments about keeping dogs away from the communion table and that sort of thing. But actually what's going on is another reimagination of the space of worship. And it's that sort of thing that in a book that I've listed on the slide at the end, the historian Ken Fincham and Nicholas Tyack have together looked at. And it is hugely controversial because people are not stupid and they recognise what is being done. They recognise that this is a change in religious policy. Now, what happens under Charles is that these sorts of changes become mandated. And what happens under Charles is that there is a prohibition on preaching about predestination. So hugely controversial theological topics are simply outlawed. And William Laud, who we saw on the previous slide, at the far end there, William Laud becomes Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. And so we've got a combination of economic instability, political instability and controversy, and the personal rule from 1629. We've got controversial religious policy being implemented and a sidelining, a very deliberate sidelining, particularly from the 1630s, of Puritan churchmen, Puritan theological opinion. So apocryphal or not, but Laud is said to have gone down a list of clergymen and written against their names, Orthodox or Puritan. And the idea that you could just define what the Church of England looked like and sideline Puritanism is a significant shift from the balance that we've seen under James. Now, the Laudians had also, as a contemporary joke put it, been very, very skillful at networking and preferment. So what did the Laudians hold? The answer to that not being what did they believe, but all the best livings in England. There was kind of takeover by stealth. The sort that people, who are conspiracy theorists in any generation see that, everybody who's getting a new job is part of that group. Certainly by the 1630s in the Church of England, everybody who's getting a new and shiny job was a Laudian or an avant-garde conformist, or whatever we want to call these people. What they certainly were not were moderate Puritans. Last week, there was a question about Scotland. And Scotland, as I say, had had a very different Reformation. Charles I decides it would be very good if both his kingdoms, both his churches, shared with the same. And so there is an attempt to impose English-style episcopacy in Scotland and a new liturgy. So the Scottish Church, since the Reformation, hadn't had a liturgical book like the Book of Common Prayer. They'd had a Book of Common Order. So it was broadly a list of instructions. So at a baptism, the minister would do this and would read a passage such as, and might preach in these terms. But it was very different from the sort of flavour of the prayer book liturgy, which tells you what to do and what to say and what the congregational prayers are. And so Charles thinks it would be a jolly good thing if his two churches worshipped according to the same, worshipped in the same way. And so in 1637, there is an attempt to introduce the Book of Common Prayer in Scotland. The particular version of the Book of Common Prayer that they attempt to introduce, the 1637 Scottish Prayer Book, which is largely put together by John Cousin, aforementioned, and Laud, and Matthew Wren, who is the then Bishop of Ely, is based on more or less entirely on the 1549 prayer book. So if we think back to when we looked at Edward's reign, the 1549 prayer book, which was much more traditional, much more conservative in its practice and in some of its theology, gave a much higher place to ceremonial than the 1552 and subsequent English prayer books had done. What they attempt to impose in Scotland is that. And that gives us a pretty clear indication of how they saw the Church of England as really being it as a church in continuity with the Reformation past, with the pre-Reformation past, rather than seeing it as a major divide, as a church that wasn't in the same ways subject to the sorts of influences of Reform Protestantism that we saw in Edward's reign and subsequently with the return of Marian exiles, but which was much more liturgical and conservative. Suffice to say that as an attempt to introduce a liturgy, it ended catastrophically badly. With 1638, Scotland goes to war as a result, more or less as a direct result of the attempt to impose this religious policy to change the Scottish Church. And in that short window of time at the end of the 1630s, there's war between England and Scotland, and then civil war breaks out in England in the years 1640 through 1642. And so 1640 is a sort of feels like a kind of fairly obvious cut-off point if we're telling a story of the Reformation in England in some ways, because what happens after 1640-42 is a complete breakdown of the sort of consensus that there had been in one version or another that there should be a single national church of which, with either the Pope or the monarch as the head. That never again happens in the same way in England after the defeat of the Royalist armies. 1644-5, what happens is that the Church of England in its settlement form is prescribed, the prayer book liturgy is prescribed, and as a result of the Westminster Assembly is replaced with the Westminster Confession and a new directory of public worship, which is much, much more like the Scottish Book of Common Order or Genevan books of discipline, things like that. Books that are books of instructions or manuals rather than prescript liturgy. How far they actually permeated in the parishes of England during the 1640s and 50s is a bit of an open question. The historian Judith Maltby looked at the prevalence, the persistence of prayer book worship during the years of the Commonwealth, so under the English Republic and under Cromwell, and concluded that there was significant adherence to prayer book practice, even when people weren't using a physical prayer book. And so there are stories of the clergyman in Staffordshire or somewhere who routinely just recites the prayer book burial service at burials, and says, "Oh, these are, wonderfully inspired words," and how godly and beautifully he's done this and preached these words and offered these prayers. Now, everybody must have known that these were the prayer book burial services, because people would have been very familiar with the texts of the prayer book. But the extent to which these were religious conflicts is particularly apparent when we bear in mind that in the course of the 1640s, English Protestants executed both the Archbishop of Canterbury and a Protestant king. So Laud was executed in 1645, January 1645, and then Charles I in 1649. The image we've got there is the frontispiece of a publication which became a very quick bestseller, interestingly, in the early 1650s, called Icon Basilicae, which is supposed to be Charles's devotional works as he's in prison and facing his execution. It was almost certainly ghost-written. But what becomes interesting is the way in which the deaths of both Laud and, to a much greater extent, Charles, then start to shape later English Anglican, word used advisedly, identity. So very, very quickly after Charles's death, the exile court in France are starting to use an order of service and prayers for the martyr king. And there becomes a whole sort of cult of Charles as king and martyr. There is a contemporary, as in present day, observance of that. That is more or less an entirely 20th century reinvention. It had died out, and when the state prayers, so the prayers for the gunpowder plot and for the anniversary of the martyrdom of Charles, when they were dropped from the prayer book in the 19th century, it was almost without controversy. But that becomes reintroduced as part of a particular version of Catholic revival from the late 19th century. But it is hugely significant at the time, and very significant in the way in which the Church of England is shaped after the Restoration. So when Charles II, son of Charles I, takes the throne, and from 1660, he claimed the throne from the death of his father, but takes the throne in 1660, and the Church of England and the prayer book liturgy are restored in 1662. That would be a whole other lecture. But what we do have certainly by the Civil Wars, and certainly by the early 1660s, is a very different sort of a Church of England. The Church of England's Reformation had been contested, it had been challenged, and then in the first part of the 17th century is reimagined. And that reimagination of what the Church of England is comes to shape what we might now call Anglicanism. So the difference between Elizabethan English settlement Protestantism and what we tend to think of as Anglicanism now is a sense that there is a distinct denomination, an identity that has certain things about it that make it Anglican, as opposed to just one expression of Reformed Protestantism. We start to see the emphases that are highlighted briefly as spoke about Hooker, thinking about theological method, about scripture and reason and tradition, whether we think of those in that three-legged stool way or not. A sort of emphasis on the fathers, an emphasis on liturgy in a way far beyond what Cranmer could have possibly imagined that we would think of, and an interest in ceremonial that is not within the keeping of English Reformed Protestantism. At the time of the Restoration, there is a parallel ejection of Presbyterian ministers who can't subscribe to the oaths required or worship according to the 1662 prayer book. So at that point, I think it's fair to argue that there is no sense in which the Church of England is even a national Protestant church in the same way as it had been before the Civil Wars. The Restoration settlement is a distinctively, deliberately small c conservative settlement. Everything about it emphasises uniformity, conformity, continuity, looks back to Elizabeth and James more so than in some ways to Charles, for obvious reasons given the political history of the middle of the 17th century. But what sort of church was the Reformation Church of England? It certainly wasn't a broad church in the way we might describe broad church Anglicanism now. It wasn't seeking to be a kind of middle way between Rome and Geneva. It certainly wasn't a church that was at all points interested in ceremonial or in continuity with the past. It certainly wasn't a church that saw itself, at least initially, as separate from the other Reformed Protestant churches of Europe. So what we've seen as we've whizzed our way through the English Reformation is a series of religious change that was at times politically driven and top-down, at times had a more of a kind of bottom-up or groundswell or popular emphasis to it. We've seen a Reformation that went through significant periods of substantial swinging pendulum religious change, but then was embedded over half a century nearly of stability and continuity and a demand for conformity. We've seen a Reformation that focused primarily on Protestantizing people through a demand for conformity of practice rather than a demand for uniformity of belief. And we've seen a Reformation which, because of the ways in which it's happened, provided an atmosphere to be revised, reimagined, and to give rise in due course to something that would develop in quite distinct ways from the sort of initial intentions of those who reformed it. I'm going to stop now, and if there are questions, comments, things people want to come back to, either specifically about this evening or more generally about this kind of question of what sort of church the Reformation Church of England was, or anything else from that, now is your moment. And thank you very much for your attention over the last 6 weeks, 5 sessions. Let me stop sharing my screen. Raise your yellow hand if you have a question. Christopher.
Hi there. I lost the thread of how you were describing Richard Hooker. I found myself right. I'll say a couple of things that I appeared to get. I kind of worked out by the end. I kind of worked out what was happening. Firstly, you seem to say he was more in favour of scripture that should form practice, but then when you were talking about the Pope as Antichrist, you seem to be saying, well, actually, he was against that kind of thing. He was more wanting to recognise the Roman Church as part of the Church. And maybe you could just re-explain for a minute or two where Richard Hooker stood, because I think I got confused about it.
Okay, sorry. One of the things about Hooker is that so the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity runs to 3 volumes, 3 physical volumes, and it's 6 books, 8 books that are published over a long, published sporadically over a long time frame. Some of it published posthumously, and some of it slightly, some of it, the authorship is not 100% certain. So there are some methodological questions when we're thinking about Hooker. But books 1 to 5 are definitely Hooker and are published in his lifetime. Now, Richard Hooker has been described by Peter Lake and by people following Peter Lake as the person who invented Anglicanism. What Hooker does, so when people tend to talk about Richard Hooker, they will talk about him as having a theological method that focuses on a 3-legged stool of scripture, reason, and tradition. And like a milkmaid's stool, they're all the same, all the legs are the same size and all equal. And if you fidget with any one of them, the stool won't work. Hooker never uses that kind of imagery, and it's not what Hooker thinks. Hooker thinks of, as in the same way as Article 6 of the 39 Articles does, Hooker clearly sees scripture as the primary source of authority. However, where he makes a significant ecclesiological move, so a significant move in terms of how he's thinking about what the church is he does not require as some of his Puritan opponents do, that every single thing that you might ever do should have specific mandate in the pages of Scripture. So he is happy to allow for diversity of practice between churches, and he thinks churches within certain confines that have freedom to determine what is best for that church, both in terms of practice and in terms of ordering. So he doesn't think that a church has to have bishops, priests, and deacons as a threefold order, but neither does he think that a church cannot have bishops, priests, and deacons, or cannot have the sort of fourfold order that Calvinist churches tend to have. So for things like matters of church order, for things that he sees as non-essential matters of practice, he concludes that churches have authority to determine, with it, under the arc of Scripture, based on circumstances and tradition, what is right and best in their context. That is significantly different from the arguments that are being made by some of the Puritans with whom he's, who are his controversial targets, if you like. Now, where that becomes a really significant move in terms of his thinking about the Roman Church is that he does not think that just because Rome does something, it is therefore wrong. Nor does he think that the Roman Church cannot be considered a church as one of the churches of Christ. That is a huge conceptual move from mainstream Reformed Protestant practice, both English and continental. And those who attack Hooker at the time recognize that. They can see that this is a huge shift, because if we think back to the sorts of defences of the early Reformation Church, one of the consistent lines of Catholic opposition to Protestant churches, English and foreign, was where was your church before Luther? So the thing that Protestant apologists have consistently argued is that our church is in continuity with the primitive church as we see it in the pages of Scripture, and the patristic church of the first 6 centuries, and then at a slightly, people plot the point at slightly different points, but somewhere around 500 or 600, it all went horribly wrong, and the Catholic Church ceased to be a true church. And so what we're doing is bringing back a church that's been lost or gone away or been corrupted, or people argue it slightly differently, but within that, those sorts of types of argument. The move Hooker is making is to say, well, no, that's not true. The Catholic Church has got some stuff wrong, but some of what they do just doesn't matter for salvation. And if that's how they want to do some things, they can do it. And just because Catholics do it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. So and I think it's important, just by way of a sort of summary to that, is to say that when later generations, particularly from the 19th century, read Hooker, particularly like John Keble, about whom Daniel can probably say much more than I can with any degree of meaning. They tend to read it as though Hooker is designing how Anglicans should do theology. Hooker is in the middle of an argument with other English Protestants about the nature of the Church of England. And so we need to keep in mind his controversial, polemical context and intention when we're reading the way he's constructing defences of certain aspects of Church of England and particularly private practice, I think. Does that help, Christopher? Thank you. David has his hand up.
Yeah, just following on from what you've been saying, Hannah, obviously you've spoken about Hooker very much in the context of thinking about church order, but presumably if you have that view of scripture, it's going to make you more open to exploring, say, the ambiguities that you find in scripture. For instance, as far as I know, there's nowhere in the scripture that says that the Bishop of Rome is the Antichrist.
No.
And also, obviously, what scripture says about predestination is perhaps more ambiguous than perhaps some of the reformers thought. So was Hooker's thinking on church order also feeding into broader thinking about other sort of received wisdoms within Geneva-type Protestantism?
Certainly. And I think his early critics know exactly that, what he's doing with that. And one of the things I think, so I think I mentioned last week when I was talking about Whitgift and his engagement in the admonition controversy. So when he gets himself into a circuit, a sort of, so there's an argument about baptism by women, and Calvin's very, very clear in institutions, cannot happen, must not happen. The argument that English Protestants make is that it's terrible that women who aren't allowed to preach are allowed to baptize. And Whitgift goes into a sort of rabbit hole of an argument. It's incredibly tortuous, in which he basically says, well, no, they're not normally, and they don't normally, but maybe they could if it was. And there are examples of women preaching in the New Testament. It's just that they don't do it in our church. And anyway, I've never heard of it happening, so it doesn't matter anyway.
Yeah.
Hooker doesn't do that. One commentator, scholar, said basically, if the prayer book had said Hooker was black, if the prayer book had said black was white, Hooker would have found a way of arguing that was the case. So Hooker constructs a defense broadly from first principles of more or less anything you can do. He's very slippery on one or two bits of controversial doctrine, and he's not unique in that. I mean, certainly, likewise, Andrew's certainly on predestination, on bits of prayer for the dead, things like is slippery. And when he thinks he's getting to places and arguments that it might be wiser not to go, he just sort of stops and says, "Oh, well, it's all very complicated. Let's move on."
That's an Anglican continuity there, Hannah, isn't it?
That is a very Anglican.
I was just thinking that we've all done that.
Well, have we not? But I think one of the other things that becomes interesting, I mean, Dermot McCulloch about 30 years ago wrote an article called The Myth of the English Reformation, which has been hugely, hugely influential. And in that article, he argued that the myth of the English Reformation was that it sort of didn't happen, or it happened in ways that were sort of special or unique, and that there's a myth of the English Reformation, mainly following people like Keble and Newman, and which is that it was all in continuity with the pre-Reformation past.
Would that be essentially arguing that the bit that took place under Elizabeth I either wasn't important or didn't really happen, or has been misrepresented, and the sort of Reformation trends you see under James and Charles are the real deal?
Precisely that. And I mean, certainly when you look at some of the particularly high church or Anglo-Catholic or whatever phrase we might want to use for them, historians of the early 20th century, they write basically as though the first person of any significance in English Reformation thought is Hooker. So when they'll talk about the Reformation divines, and they'll talk about Hooker and Andrews and Cousin and Lord, and you're like, so have you Thomas Cranmer? And as though Cranmer didn't exist, and John Jewel, who wrote the very famous apology for the Church of England that was published in 1565, as though he didn't exist, as though basically none of what happened in the middle of the 16th century had any longer term validity. And they will typically focus in broadly the same way as Cousin and Wren and Laud do in 1637 in Scotland, as though the proper prayer book was the 1549 one, and emphasise its continuity with the Sarum Missal rather than its radical departures and continuities with Protestant orders of service.
Just one last question and then I'll stop.
That's all right.
You're very patient with me. Obviously, under Charles in particular, Puritan thinking, moderate Puritanism within the Church of England became unfashionable and perhaps unwelcome.
Yeah.
Where did they go? I mean, obviously, I guess they had a heyday during the Commonwealth, but under the Restoration, presumably they continued to be marginalised. Where did they go? Did they just hunker down and wait for better times, or did they leave?
Some stayed.
Mm-hmm.
Some stayed being grumpy.
Yeah.
Some left. Mm-hmm. Some were effectively kicked out by the Restoration. It became much, I think, if there's any point at which the Church of England in the broad Reformation period can really be called a broad church, I think it's under James. And that just becomes increasingly untenable under Charles. And then because of how chaotic English religion becomes during the years of the Commonwealth, and how fragmented and plural English Protestantism becomes, with some really radical strains, some of which we still recognise today, Baptists, Quakers, and they're part, they become part of the English religious landscape. But others that disappear completely. In the mid 1640s, all the religious censorship laws are revoked, and it's like this huge explosion of extraordinary radical religious thought and publication, and very, very quickly the government starts to kind of, try and push the lid back down on it, because, nobody wants chaos. and so I think anything that, because it becomes so, and people who are really unhappy leave. I mean, some of them come back again, but the numbers of people going to the New World, for example, in the 1630s goes up remarkably. Some of them do come back again, but it's a varied picture, and it, like lots of other things, it depends where you look, and in lots of parishes, I suspect people broadly carried on more or less as they had done.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for the last 5 talks. Really appreciated them.
Thank you. Daniel, is it? You're mute.
I'm mute, sorry, yes. At 16 past 4, that's probably about time to draw to a close.
Yeah.
But I think everyone would want to echo what David's just said, Hannah. It's been a real tour de force, and you have explained many complex shifts and shifts in historical shifts, but also shifts in the history of ideas and theology very, very clearly, and with great humor as well. I've certainly, it's refreshed a lot of my learning from a long time ago, and you put it all up to date. So a huge thank you from all of us. And well, we hope we might be able to tempt you back at some point to give another lecture. But if you've missed any of the lectures that that Hannah's given, they are on the Cathedral Theology Network website, so do have a look there, and I also look at some of the other lectures coming up in the new year, including one on Eastern Orthodoxy by Gregory, who started that, introduced Hannah in the first session. So and for mystics, and I think hopefully something on Bonhoeffer as well. So, and it's about time I did something. So I shall probably be doing something on Dominicans and get that out of my system. But anyway, I wish you all, in the meantime, a very, very happy Christmas. And again, Hannah, if we could all give you a round of applause, I'm sure I shall do it on Bonhoeffer.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. It's been a lot of fun, and thank you for questions and engagement, and thank you for having me, and have a lovely Christmas, everyone.
Hannah, you must...
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Hannah.
you.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Thank you, Hannah. Great.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannah.
Thanks, everyone. It's been lovely to see some differently familiar faces and lots of people who have become familiar faces. So, okay. Bye.
Bye. Bye.